The information provided in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship with Foyle Legal. For advice tailored to your situation, please consult a qualified legal professional. Welcome to Personal Injury Claims Explained by Foyle Legal, your trusted source for understanding personal injury claims in Western Australia. Each week, we simplify complex legal issues, from motor vehicle accidents to workplace injuries, so you can confidently navigate your rights and claim the compensation you deserve.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
Going about your day, trip on a curb, maybe that game of basketball got a little too intense, and suddenly, bam, you're sidelined with an injury.
It really makes you realize how much we rely on our bodies to function.
Yeah, not just physically, but financially too. So while the pain and suffering of an injury are definitely top of mind, today's deep dive is all about something we don't always think about right away, that financial ripple effect, claiming lost income. And let's be real, it's not as simple as just, oh, I missed work, so I get this many paychecks.
Right.
It's way more complicated than that.
It definitely is.
So to help us navigate this whole legal maze, we're joined by our expert on all things compensation and law. All right, so let's unpack this. We're diving into some excerpts from Foyle Legal. It's an Australian legal website, and we're going to try to really understand some of the nuances of these lost income claims. You know, those things that you might not realize until it's too late. Think of it like a crash course in what you need to know to protect yourself, just in case.
Exactly.
So on the surface, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. You can't work, so you lose wages. Simple, right?
Wow.
Well, this article breaks down why it's not always so cut and dry. And they use a few examples, which I always find helpful. Real life situations. So bear with me here. They start by talking about Shirley. She's a PE teacher, so super relatable. She's at lunch, the table collapses, and boom, broken leg. It happens. She can't work for 2 months, and then she goes part-time for another month. And it seems pretty open and shut that she's owed those lost wages, right?
Right.
But I'm curious, even in a case like Shirley's that seems pretty straightforward,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that people might overlook when it comes to actually claiming that lost income?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you've hit on something really important there. So while her case does seem very straightforward, it actually highlights a really common stumbling block, and that's partial work capacity. A lot of people just assume that it's all or nothing. So you're either completely out of commission or you're back at work at 100%. But Shirley's case shows us that even if you can do some work, you're still entitled to compensation for that difference in what you can earn.
That makes a lot of sense. And honestly, it's not something I would have necessarily thought about. Like, you just kind of get caught up in that, well, it's all or nothing. Okay, so we've got lost wages, we've got this partial income thing, but then they throw kind of a curveball. They talk about Jacob, who was actually unemployed at the time of his injury. And I have to admit, my first thought was, well, that's tough, but is there really a claim there? So in a situation like Jacob's, like, what options are even available?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because Jacob's case speaks to this idea of loss of opportunity. So in his case, he was all set to start this new job. He was going to be working in the mines, had the offer all lined up, but it was contingent on a health check, which he unfortunately failed because of injuries that he sustained in an accident.
Wait, so he had a job offer, he was injured, and that directly prevented him from being able to take the job. That's wild. I had no idea that was even something you could claim.
Yeah, and it's a really critical point, I think. You're not just limited to what you were actively earning, but you're also entitled to what you were demonstrably on track to earn as well. And of course, proving this is a lot more complex than if you were just going back and showing your pay stubs, you know?
Yeah.
But the article emphasizes that it is possible to do. And this is why I think understanding these nuances is so important, because we're not just talking about your current paycheck. We're talking about potential income that you've been prevented from earning.
Okay, so we've got lost wages, we've got partial income, now we've got loss of opportunity. It's already way more complex than I think most people realize.
Yeah.
And then, just to add another layer, they even mention lost business profits. That sounds like a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you are self-employed, make sure you come back for that episode, because that is a whole other ball game.
Duly noted. But for now, let's stick with kind of this individual claim focus. And with that in mind, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how you actually go about proving these claims. Because just saying, hey, I missed out on some money, that's clearly not enough. The article really digs into the evidence you need to actually support a claim. And it gets, I'm not going to lie, a little dense with the legalese. So let's break it down. And let's start with something that seems like it should be really straightforward. Tax returns. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Like, here's my income history, black and white.
It seems that way, doesn't it?
But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
You're right, it's not. And here's the catch. People, they often try to minimize their taxable income, right? Which is perfectly legal, of course,
right,
for tax purposes. But if you're then claiming that you made way more than your tax return reflects because you need to prove lost income,
right,
that can raise some red flags.
Yeah, it's almost like you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, where you're trying to be savvy with your taxes, which is smart. But then if you actually need to have that income accurately documented, it can backfire.
Absolutely. And that's why the article really emphasizes this idea of having additional proof of your usual earning power. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, these official documents. If you're freelance, for example, it could be invoices, your client list, even testimonials that you have about the rates that you charge. It's about painting a comprehensive picture, really.
That makes a lot of sense. And it actually reminds me of when I first went freelance and I was so overwhelmed with just like trying to get paid, let alone like keeping track of every little invoice. And it was not pretty come tax time. So listeners, a little organization goes a long way in these situations.
You're telling me.
Speaking of which, they mentioned pay slips, which again seems pretty straightforward. Like, here are your wages, this is what you make. But the article mentions that things like gig work and FIFO arrangements can make that a little messy. So what do they mean by that?
Yeah, so they're highlighting another really important point, I think, which is non-standard employment. So when we think about gig work, FIFO arrangements, things like that, often there's fluctuating income. There are multiple employers, multiple contracts sometimes. So in those cases, it is absolutely vital that you are meticulously documenting everything.
Yeah.
If your income stream isn't, a traditional 9-to-5, don't just rely on a platform's records or anything like that. Keep your own really detailed logs.
Oh, man. Flashbacks to early freelancing days. Receipts shoved in drawers. Not good. Okay. And while we're on the topic of documentation, there's another sort of gold mine of information that people often overlook. They're employment contracts.
Oh, yeah.
Because those often have clauses about allowances, overtime, all that stuff that goes above and beyond your base hourly rate.
Exactly. And it made me think, do you actually know what's in your employment contract?
Right.
Many people don't. But that document can be really crucial in a lost income claim, especially if it outlines benefits or bonuses that you'd be entitled to even while you're out of work,
Okay, new to-do list item. Find that dusty file and actually read my employment contract. So this is all great information for how we build a case for lost income based on what you were already earning. But then the article takes this almost philosophical turn and it starts talking about future loss. And that sounds a little intimidating, to be honest. So what exactly does that mean in this context?
Yeah, so that's where I think it does get really complex, because now we're not just talking about what you're making, but what you would have made. And that's inherently uncertain, right?
Yeah, I can imagine that's where things get really tricky legally. Like, how do you even begin to prove something like that?
It's definitely more complicated. And the article uses an example, I think, to really illustrate this well. They talk about John, who is a boilermaker. And he's earning a good wage when he's injured on the job. So you might think, okay, well, we just calculate his lost income based on what he was making. But it actually goes beyond that.
Right, because he was probably due for raises, promotions.
Yeah.
Like, his whole career trajectory suddenly becomes relevant.
Exactly. And it might not even just be about John's individual path, right? It could also be about the overall growth potential in his field. So if you're in a booming industry, if you're on track for, that big promotion, that can all play into these calculations as well.
So it's like your career ambitions, even just like the state of your entire industry, that becomes legal evidence.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, but also a little daunting, to be honest. Is there anything else people should be aware of when it comes to this whole future loss idea?
Yeah, there's another layer to it, and it's a big one. Pre-existing conditions.
Okay.
So even if you were working through something just fine, it can still have an impact on your claim. Remember John, the boilermaker?
Yeah.
He had a pre-existing shoulder issue. And even though it wasn't preventing him from doing his job when he was injured, it could be argued that it might have limited his future earning capacity anyway.
Ah, so it's like the legal equivalent of skeletons in the closet.
Kind of, yeah. And this is really where that medical evidence becomes paramount, I think. Because it's not just about proving that you're injured, but actually demonstrating how that injury specifically is going to impact your ability to work in your field long term. And that includes any pre-existing conditions that might factor into the equation.
Right, because if you're a concert pianist and you injure your hand, that's obviously going to have a very different impact on your future earning capacity than if you have like a desk job, for example.
Absolutely. And you'd probably have to have medical professionals weigh in on that, which just adds another layer of complexity to the whole process.
This is making me realize that claiming lost income is kind of like presenting your life's resume to a judge and jury. Like your work history, your potential, your health, it's all up for scrutiny.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of scrutiny, there is one group that often faces even greater challenges when it comes to claiming lost income.
Yeah.
The self-employed.
You're not kidding. The article doesn't sugarcoat it when it comes to self-employed folks claiming lost income.
In fact, they call it more difficult, and from the sounds of it, that might be an understatement.
It can be a real uphill battle.
Remember how we talked about the importance of having additional proof of income even as an employee?
Yeah.
Well, multiply that when you're self-employed. Your income naturally fluctuates. Your expenses are often intertwined with your personal finances, and your tax return only tells a fraction of the story.
It's like you're not just proving a salary, you're proving the entire value of your business.
Exactly. You might need to demonstrate how the injury impacts your ability to attract new clients, fulfill existing contracts, even the long-term reputation of your business. It's a much more intricate calculation.
So for any freelancers or entrepreneurs listening, this is a wake-up call.
Yeah.
If you're thinking this could be me someday, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this?
2 words: documentation and expert help. Get into the habit of meticulously documenting your income A&D expenses, and not just for tax season. Think of it as building a safety net for your business. And if you ever do need to make a claim, bring in an accountant and a lawyer as early in the process as possible. They can be invaluable assets in helping you build the strongest possible case.
Solid advice. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. And I have to say, it's a bit overwhelming even for someone like me who enjoys digging into this kind of stuff. But so important to know, right?
Absolutely. And while this particular article was Australian-focused, it's worth noting that the general principles apply universally. The less standard your employment, the more proactive you need to be. Whether you're freelancing, driving for a rideshare app, or running your own business, think of meticulous documentation as an insurance policy for your livelihood.
It really makes you stop and think, what am I doing right now to protect myself just in case?
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, the source mentioned that there are actually time limits for filing these types of claims, which vary widely depending on where you are.
That's right. And those time limits can be surprisingly short, so it's crucial to be aware of them.
That alone sounds like a rabbit hole worth exploring.
Definitely.
Well, listeners, if this deep dive has your gears turning, we encourage you to do your own research. What resonated with you? What questions came up for you? Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to protecting yourself and your income.
Thank you for listening to Personal Injury Claims Explained by Foyle Legal. We hope this episode helped clarify your rights and next steps in your injury claim. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and visit foylelegal.com for more useful information. See you next time.